Good morning, Pine Ridge. Wish we could be there this morning. I don't know exactly what this test means. I'm not a scientist, but either it means Kathy and I have COVID or we're going to have twins. So I figured either way, I should probably stay home today. No, Kathy and I, we both tested positive for COVID Friday night, and so this is a first for me. In 20 years of being a pastor, I've never missed being there on a Sunday morning due to sickness, and so. This is a new thing for me, and really right before the end of the pandemic. Really, like next week, masks are coming off. It's probably not surprising for those who know me. I've always been a bit of a procrastinator. This is actually the first time I've been sick in 2 years, and sure enough, right before the end, we get sick. Obviously, I'm not that bad. I just didn't want to risk it and didn't want to give anybody else COVID, so we're staying home this week. So I have decided to pre-record my sermon this week, and before I start, I wanted to show a video clip. So we'll go ahead and do that now. Can you even begin to imagine what that must have felt like for the Israelites? I mean, to be standing there between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea, and then this cloud of fire comes down and just separates the two of you. I mean, just imagine the range of emotions that you would have felt throughout the entire experience. Like, in a very short period of time, you probably would have felt some kind of relief, some kind of despair, some kind of fear, some kind of hope, awe, joy. All of it just all wrapped up into one. If you've ever been rescued from something, then you probably have some idea of what this feels like. For me, when I think of the word rescue, I think of my mom. I probably was about 5 years old, and we'd been invited over to our neighbor's house to go swimming. And I didn't really know how to swim yet, and so I was told to stay in the shallow end. And of course, being the curious child, I had to figure out, well, where exactly does the shallow end end? And so I started, feeling with my feet to where the deep end might begin, and it was one of those pools that had like a slope, a slippery slope you hear about, and sure enough, they are slippery. And so I got 2 feet onto the slope, and I started sliding, and I was down. I was heading towards the deep end, and I started to panic, and then out of nowhere, an angel appeared in a tiger striped swimsuit. And it was my mom. She had dove in after me, and she grabbed me and pulled me to the surface, and she rescued me. When you're in too deep, when you're in over your head, you need someone else to rescue you. That's what this series is about. We're starting a new series today. God is our champion. He's our rescuer, and he has a long history of fighting our battles for us. So over the next few weeks, we're going to explore some of these stories of God rescuing the Israelites and eventually us. And today I wanted to start with the story of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. But in order to do that, you really need to start the beginning of Exodus and talk about the 10 plagues. There was the water turning to blood, the plague of frogs. Next one is it's either gnats or it's lice, and I'm not sure which one would be worse. The plague of flies, the plague of disease on the livestock, boils, hail and fire, locusts, darkness, and finally the death of the firstborn sons. And what you see through all of that is that God is at work rescuing Israel. I mean, really, Israel has to do nothing. Israel has to do very little anyway. Moses doesn't really have to do much more. It is God who is doing all of these amazing things, these amazing mighty works to convince Pharaoh to let his people go. And finally, with the death of the firstborn sons, it's enough. And Pharaoh sends God's people away, at least for a little while. And then he decides to chase after them. And then we see that scene where, we just watched the movie clip from Prince of Egypt. And Pharaoh his army comes over the crest of the hill, and the Israelites are stuck between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea. And that's where we'll pick up the story. Exodus chapter 14, starting in verse 10. As Pharaoh approached, the people of Israel looked up and panicked when they saw the Egyptians overtaking them. And they cried out to the Lord. And that's probably, the smartest thing that they've done so far. Psalm 46:1 says that God is our refuge and strength, always ready to help in times of trouble. It doesn't last very long, though. They cry out to the Lord, and then very quickly, verse 11, they said to Moses, "Why did you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? Weren't there enough graves for us in Egypt? What have you done to us? Why did you make us leave Egypt? Didn't we tell you this would happen while we were still in Egypt? We said, 'Leave us alone. Let us be slaves to the Egyptians. It's better to be a slave in Egypt than a corpse in the wilderness.'" And so, whether they realize it or not, they're actually being quite ironic here. Egypt was known for its graves. I mean, it's a land of nothing but opportunity for grave sites. So when they said, were there not enough graves for us in Egypt? I mean, the most famous graves in the world probably are the pyramids. But the Israelites here are just angry, and they're afraid, and so they lash out at Moses. And then they say some crazy things. We wish we were back in Egypt. We wish it'd be better to be a slave. There's a number of phrases throughout history that have gone against that. Live free or die is the motto of, I think it's New Hampshire, which is an odd place. You don't really think of New Hampshire when you think of, this mentality of live free or die. At least I don't, but I guess that's them. The idea of give me liberty or give me death. Benjamin Franklin famously said that those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. But the Israelites, they're kind of feeling the opposite. And I can't say how I would feel. I mean, I've never had that experience where you are up against, death. Maybe I would prefer to be a slave. I can't say for sure. But certainly, Benjamin Franklin wouldn't have thought too highly of what the Israelites were saying here. It's better to be a slave in Egypt. Well, I think a lot of people would have said it's better to die in freedom than to die as a slave, or to live as a slave. But at any rate, Moses isn't hearing it. He says, "Don't be afraid. Just stand still and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see will never be seen again. The Lord himself will fight for you. Just stay calm." Another translation there is just be quiet. Okay, just stop. Israel, just take a moment here and recognize who's up against you and who is for you. God is going to fight this battle for you. Look what he's done so far. I mean, all these different plagues that just shows his amazing, mighty power. God's got this. Just relax. And then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me?" Which is interesting because it tells you that Moses was saying one thing to the Israelites, but there's a part of him that was also afraid. And he's doing the right thing. He's trying to say to Israel, be strong, trust in the Lord. And yet maybe he's like that guy in the New Testament. I believe, help my unbelief to God. And God says, "What are you crying out to me? Tell the people to get moving. Pick up your staff and raise your hand over the sea. Divide the water so the Israelites can walk through the middle of the sea on dry ground." In other words, God's saying, I'm giving you a way out. Trust in me. Tell them to relax, but you also need to relax, Moses. You need to do what I'm telling you to do. Get people moving. Take a step of faith. And it starts with you, putting your hand over the sea. Divide the water. I don't know if Moses had this expectation. I don't know if he thought that they were going to find some other way across. I don't know what was going through Moses' head. But God knew exactly what was going to happen. God had a plan right from the beginning. God wasn't off track. He led them exactly where he wanted to lead them. And he was going to save them exactly the way he wanted to save them. God goes on. He says, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians. To harden the heart basically means to make stubborn. And the Egyptians were already stubborn. I mean, we see that phrase a number of times in Exodus. It starts with Pharaoh, though. You know, Pharaoh hardened his own heart before God did. Pharaoh was stubborn, and God allowed him to be stubborn. And then he allowed his Egyptian army to be stubborn. He said they will charge in after the Israelites. See, God's not just going to save the Israelites here. He's also going to punish Egypt. My great glory will be displayed through Pharaoh and his troops, his chariots and his charioteers. See, Pharaoh thinks that his glory is going to be shown through his army, but God says, no, my glory will be shown through Pharaoh's army. Not by their victory, but by their defeat. When my glory is displayed through them, all Egypt will see my glory and know that I am the Lord. See, we didn't really talk about this before with all the plagues, but all the plagues apparently have some kind of connection to an Egyptian god. And so God was basically showing Pharaoh and all the Egyptians that I am greater than any god you might follow. You want to worship the Nile? I'm going to turn it to blood. You know, you might worship the flies. I'm going to send them against you. You might worship, whatever it was. You know, the ultimate one, the sun god, right? You hear about the Egyptians following the sun god. Well, I'm going to take that away completely. I'm just going to bring darkness on the land. God says, I am more powerful. You will recognize that by the end, and I will show you my glory through the defeat of your army. The angel of the Lord, who had been leading the people of Israel, moved to the rear of the camp. The pillar of cloud also moved to the front and stood behind them. The cloud settled between the Egyptian and the Israelite camps. As darkness fell, the cloud turned to fire, lighting up the night. But the Egyptians and the Israelites did not approach each other all night. And we saw, a version of that in the Prince of Egypt clip. And it's amazing to see the way they covered that. See, in my mind, I just sort of read this, and it's a calm cloud that separates them. I mean, that was showing, fire separating them in an exciting way. I don't know exactly how it happened. All I know is that God used his power to save Israel in this way. And he created darkness on the side of the Egyptians and light on the side of the Israelites so they could see where they were supposed to go. And the Egyptians would not be able to see them. Then Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the Lord opened up a path through the water with a strong east wind. Moses is now doing what God told him to do earlier. And, we sort of see this again in the video clip or any other way that this has been shown, and it just sort of happens all at one moment. But it from reading this, it actually sounds like it took like the entire night for this to happen. And Pharaoh's army is trying to get at Israel, and God's keeping them safe and separate, and maybe moving them from slightly here and there so the Egyptians can't find them. But all this while, God is at work creating an escape for them, creating a rescue for them. And all Moses has to do is raise his hand over the sea, and God does the rest. All Israel has to do is take one step of faith, and God does the rest. The Lord opened a path through the water with a strong east wind. The wind blew all that night, turning the seabed into dry land. So the people of Israel walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground with walls of water on each side. Just imagine what that would have been like. I mean, probably as much as moving the water was a miracle, maybe the biggest miracle here is that the land is now dry. Just imagine what it's like when, water at low tide or high tide, whatever it is, when the water recedes and you step out into the ground. I mean, it's still soaking wet. It's muddy. Imagine being at the bottom of a river or a seabed that's been covered with water for ages. It would be just a mucky mess. But here, it's dry ground. God must have put so much fresh air or wind through it that it dried out the ground. And so now Israel can walk across. But again, think of how little they had to do. One simple step of faith. But even as I say that, I realize sometimes that step of faith isn't so simple. I remember being at a Good Friday Youth Rally years ago. And I was at a place, I grew up in a Christian home. I made a commitment to God when I was like 5 years old. maybe even younger than that. But I always like to say now that I inherited my parents' faith. I just did what I was supposed to do. I did what they wanted me to do. And I probably understood it as much as I could at the time. But over the years, I kind of drifted away from that. And, there's a saying that there are no such thing as grandchildren in God's kingdom. Everyone has to make a decision for themselves. It's not enough that your parents believe. It's not enough that your grandparents believe. You have to come to that faith decision yourself. And so I remember being at a Good Friday youth rally. This was an event that took place every Good Friday in the Toronto area. All the churches from our denomination would come together, and all the teenagers would come together, and there'd usually be some great speaker, and there'd always be a gospel message. And I remember sitting there, actually I was standing against the back wall, and I was hearing this message, and it was speaking right to my heart. I mean, it was God calling me, saying, I know you believe because your parents have told you, but it's time for you to take that step of faith yourself. And I remember standing there, and when the altar call came, I mean, I even got as far as pulling my back off the wall, like I was going to go forward. And then I started to think, what's everyone else going to think? I mean, I'm supposed to already be a Christian, I'm supposed to be a believer. What are my friends going to think? Are they going to think I'm one of those, weirdos who's going to the front like everybody else? Like I looked to see who was going to the front, and I started to think about what other people thought more than what God thought. And there was I had this huge desire to go forward, and yet there was this battle within me to just not let me move. And then the moment passed. The speaker came back up again and prayed the closing prayer, and that was that. And it was years later that I finally took that step of faith for myself. I mean, we could debate all day long whether I was actually a Christian and this was like a rededication, or it doesn't really matter. All I know is that it wasn't, my faith didn't feel real until years later. And I think I could have started that process a lot earlier if I had taken that step of faith that day. And so I know I say simple step of faith, and yet there's a part of me that knows that it's not as simple as I might be letting on. It's a battle that goes on inside you. Verse 23 says, "Then the Egyptians, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and charioteers, chased them into the middle of the sea." God was allowing them to be stubborn. "Just before the dawn, the Lord looked down on the Egyptian army from the pillar of fire and cloud, and he threw their forces into total confusion. He twisted their chariot wheels, making their chariots difficult to drive. 'Let's get out of here, away from these Israelites,' the Egyptians shouted. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Even the Egyptians realized that God was fighting this battle for them. I don't know exactly what was going on here with the wheels. My guess is it was probably they were getting bogged down in the mud. The mud that God allowed to be dry ground when Israel walked through was now mud again. At least that's what I think was happening. But either way, the Egyptians realized that God is on the side of the Israelites here, and he's fighting for them. Psalm 77 talks about this in a little more exciting language, I think. Verse 16 to 20, it says, "When the Red Sea saw you, O God, its waters looked and trembled. The sea quaked to its very depths. The clouds poured down rain, and thunder rumbled in the sky. Your arrows of lightning flashed, your thunder roared from the whirlwind. The lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your road led through the sea, your pathway through the mighty waters, a pathway no one knew was there. You led your people along that road like a flock of sheep, with Moses and Aaron as their shepherds." Imagine what it would have been like to experience that, to see God's to see God's hand at work with all the fire and the water separated. I mean, it would be amazing. My family and I went to the aquarium in Toronto, where you see all the sea life floating by with the glass, and that was awesome enough. But God's original is always better than man's recreation. So just imagine what it would have been like for the Israelites to walk through and see, all the sea life through the water, and just, you'd be so tempted to reach out and touch it, and yet also terrified to think, well, what if I break it or something like that? Just, it would have been an amazing experience. Verse 26, "When all the Israelites had reached the other side, the Lord said to Moses, 'Raise your hand over the sea again, so the waters will rush back and cover the Egyptians and their chariots and charioteers.' So as the sun began to rise, Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the water rushed back into its usual place. The Egyptians tried to escape, but the Lord swept them into the sea. Then the waters returned and covered all the chariots and charioteers, the entire army of Pharaoh. Of all the Egyptians who had chased the Israelites into the sea, not a single one survived. God was making his glory known to all the world, letting them know that there is a God in Israel, and he fights for Israel, and he is more powerful than any other. See, there are two sides to God's cloud: salvation and grace on one hand, and judgment and death on the other. This cloud that separated Israel from Egypt. On Israel's side, it was a pillar of fire. It was giving light. It was showing them the way to salvation. It was clearing a path for them. But on the other side, for the Egyptians, it was darkness and judgment, and it was God's way of showing his glory through their defeat, not their rescue. Verse 29 says, "But the people of Israel had walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground, as the water stood up like a wall on both sides. That is how the Lord rescued Israel from the hand of the Egyptians that day. And the Israelites saw the bodies of the Egyptians washed up on the seashore." When the people of Israel saw the mighty power that the Lord had unleashed against the Egyptians, they were filled with awe before him. They put their faith in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Imagine what it's like to be an Israelite in that situation. Wouldn't your reaction be the same as theirs? In fact, if you're a Christian, hasn't your experience been the same? You've gone from a place of hopelessness, a realization that you're in over your head, that you need to be rescued, that there's no way you can save yourself. And your Savior comes and fights the ultimate battle in your place and carries you to safety to the other side. And all you needed to do was take one little step of faith. And if that's you, and I know it's most of us at Pine Ridge, our response is the same as the Israelites. Filled with awe at his mighty works, we worship him. But maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you find yourself at the edge of the sea. You're just now starting to realize that you need a Savior, and God's cloud is dividing things for you. He's lit the path for you, and you're realizing that on one side of God there's death and judgment. But you're starting to see the light, that he's opened up a path to grace and salvation. And all that's required from you is one step of faith. To accept Jesus as your Savior and Lord. And if that's you, take that step of faith today. Don't be like me when I was younger, with your back glued to the chair, wanting to move forward but afraid of what others might think. Don't let anyone or anything get in the way of you taking that step to freedom and salvation. Almost every week, we have an open mic prayer time in the service. We're about to go into that prayer time right now. So I'll invite our team to come forward now. I want to encourage you, if you're at that point where you feel God tugging on your heart, come forward this morning and tell our prayer team that you're ready to take that step of faith. Don't wait. Don't worry about what someone else might think. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through him. So we fix our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Take that step right now. You will not regret it.